My home, they claimed, was a blight on the neighborhood that deserved to be torched. It wasn't until 3 months afterward that they learned I was the federal jurist responsible for incarcerating crooked public servants for 2 decades. I am currently standing in the ruin of my former living room, where the scent of damp ash tenaciously clings to every surface like a concealed transgression. You can make out the wind moaning through the skeletal framework of what were once handcrafted log beams. With every move, glass crunches beneath my boots, shards from windows that used to frame mountain dawns I will never witness again. The security recording is undeniable. It shows HOA President Patricia Blackwood orchestrating what she termed a controlled burn due to purported fire safety infractions. The irony is, my house had passed every single inspection. However, they made a grave miscalculation when they opted to tamper with fire. They neglected to inquire about my former profession. I wonder what you would do if your own HOA attempted to literally smoke you out. Let me rewind 6 months to a time when life was less complicated and I held the naive belief that people were inherently good. My name is Samuel Riverside, Sam, to those close to me, and at 58 years old, I possess the battle scars to attest to a life fully lived. I had recently concluded a 20-year term on the federal bench, exchanging my judicial robes for flannel shirts and pursuing the dream of a tranquil retirement on my grandfather's 40-acre ranch in Pinehurst Valley, Colorado, a place where the morning atmosphere carries the fragrance of pine and promise. The land had belonged to my family since 1952, long before homeowner associations and their community rules were ever conceived. I had dedicated the past 2 years to transforming my grandpa's original cabin into something extraordinary, with solar panels glistening on the roof, sophisticated rainwater harvesting systems, and an organic garden that would delight any conservationist. It was then that Patricia Blackwood blew into my existence like a meticulously styled whirlwind. At 52, Trish sported aggressive blonde streaks that declared, "I demand to see the person in charge." She had relocated to our valley 3 years prior, following a divorce that armed her with a real estate license and enough acrimonious energy to illuminate a small town. In just 6 months, she had shrewdly secured the presidency of the HOA for the new Pinehurst Valley development, which had emerged around the historic ranch lands like suburban fungi after a storm. The aroma of her costly perfume reached me even before her BMW's tires crunched on my gravel drive that morning. "You must be the one holding out," she stated, exiting her vehicle in heels entirely unsuited for ranch terrain. Her smile was keen enough to slice glass. "I'm Trish Blackwood, president of the Pinehurst Valley Homeowners Association. Having just completed an adjustment to my solar panel setup, I wiped my hands on a cloth. Sam Riverside, a pleasure. We'll see about that." Her gaze scanned my property as if a general inspecting hostile ground. "We must address your compliance deficiencies." I couldn't restrain a small laugh. "Ma'am, this property was established 30 years before your HOA. I have the legal papers if you're interested in seeing them." Her smile wavered for barely a moment before locking back into position. "We shall see about that, mountain man." The sound of her heels clicking resentfully back to her vehicle should have been my initial warning. Still, my mind was operating like a judge's, presuming that individuals would abide by the law and adhere to established protocols. What I was unaware of was that Trish Blackwood operated by her own set of rules, ones that had no connection to justice. Her realty company had just inked an exclusive contract with Pinnacle Development Group, and my 40 acres of prime valley land signified a $2 million opportunity for a new subdivision. All that stood in their way was one obstinate old man who needed to vanish. Within a week, the anonymous grievances began inundating the county offices. Non-existent septic violations, nonsensical zoning infractions, and building code complaints for structures that had been correctly permitted and inspected. Each day brought a different county inspector to my home, and each departed with the same puzzled look and identical finding. Everything was entirely lawful. But Trish was only getting warmed up. I detected the scent of impending trouble carried on the autumn breeze, something sharp and frantic that had no relation to the turning foliage. One morning, I discovered surveyor stakes near my property boundary, hammered into the ground like miniature tombstones. My neighbors, believing I was merely a retired contractor who had come into some land, were oblivious that they were witnessing a federal judge girding for the battle of his life. 2 decades of dispatching corrupt politicians and white-collar felons to federal prison had honed my ability to identify predators, and Patricia Blackwood was circling for a final assault. 3 weeks later, Trish executed her first significant maneuver, and it was a masterpiece of malice. I was hosting my grandson's 8th birthday celebration. Nothing extravagant, just hamburgers on the grill and children darting around the yard like over-caffeinated squirrels, when a processed server materialized at my front gate. The timing was deliberate. Trish aimed for peak humiliation and disruption, and she achieved both. Samuel Riverside? The server seemed uneasy, likely because 8-year-old Tommy was gazing at him, a half-eaten slice of cake in his hand. You are being served with a lawsuit concerning water rights violations that are impacting the neighborhood supply. The legal documents were substantial enough to serve as a doorstop, filed by Winston Cartwright III, Esquire, the type of attorney whose name's Roman numerals signal his hourly rate. The suit alleged that my water consumption was somehow depleting the entire community's supply, a claim that was scientifically baseless since we all possessed independent wells. However, facts are seldom a priority in campaigns of legal harassment. By the following morning, Channel 7 News was broadcasting the story. Reclusive landowner hoards water while neighbors suffer. The reporter skillfully portrayed my rainwater collection barrels as some sort of environmental atrocity. I had to concede Trish's talent for media manipulation. She had converted conservation into a conspiracy in under 24 hours. But here is the part nobody was aware of. I hadn't endured 20 years as a federal judge by retreating from bullies. While Trish was occupied with her media antics, I was engaged in what I do best: research. A few calls to former courthouse associates revealed that Patricia Blackwood had been disciplined 3 times by the State Real Estate Board for ethical breaches. Her development associate, Pinnacle Properties, had questionable links to the city planning department through a network of familial ties that would make a genealogist's head spin. Most revealingly, a standard public records request uncovered financial discrepancies in the HOA's ledgers, with nearly $200,000 in unexplained expenditures over the preceding 18 months. I submitted my countersuit that very day, alleging harassment and defamation, and I demanded a comprehensive audit of the HOA's finances. Years of observing intimidated defendants taught me that bullies typically crumble when confronted with genuine legal repercussions, particularly when they face the prospect of covering your legal costs. Leveraging my federal court connections, I saw to it that the case was allocated to Judge Martinez, a jurist known for having no tolerance for baseless lawsuits. The court hearing was set for the next Tuesday, and Cartwright showed up with the confidence of a man anticipating an easy victory over some uneducated rustic. He carried a briefcase brimming with costly legal maneuvers and a patronizing smirk that was likely effective on easily daunted homeowners. What he hadn't anticipated was confronting a man who had authored more legal briefs than Cartwright had likely perused in his entire life. I presented myself with full judicial gravitas, the sort of quiet command that develops from 2 decades of presiding over federal courtrooms. My legal briefs were immaculately drafted, my evidence was methodically arranged, and my arguments were as sharp as a diamond cutter. When Judge Martinez inquired about the scientific foundation for the water shortage allegations, Cartwright's confident exterior shattered like cheap paint under a desert sun. "Your Honor," I stated, rising with the deliberate poise of a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. The plaintiff's assertions defy basic hydrogeology. Independent wells cannot impact one another's supply unless they draw from the same shallow aquifer, a scenario which geological surveys confirm is not the case here. I displayed the hydrogeological analysis I had commissioned, featuring detailed charts that illustrated distinct water sources for every property. The courthouse marble amplified the sound of Cartwright's confidence disintegrating. Judge Martinez dismissed Trish's lawsuit with prejudice and granted me full legal fees, nearly $15,000 that would be paid directly from Trish's funds. The expression on Cartwright's face was invaluable. "You failed to mention he was an attorney," he hissed at Trish as they gathered their documents. But the real spectacle unfolded in the courthouse parking area. Trish was posted by my truck, her meticulously maintained composure finally fracturing. "You think you're so clever with your high-priced legal maneuvers?" she snarled, poking a finger toward my chest. The afternoon light glinted off the diamond wedding ring she had evidently retained as a memento from her divorce. This is not finished, Judge Nobody. I will make your existence so miserable you will plead to sell that worthless land. She stalked away toward her BMW, the sharp click of her heels on the asphalt echoing like gunshots in the tranquil afternoon. Her tires left dark streaks on the courthouse pavement, likely violating several city ordinances. I observed her departure with the serene contentment of a man who had just witnessed his adversary expose her true character in full view of security cameras. 2 weeks following her courtroom defeat, Trish opted for a more inventive approach with infrastructure warfare. I awoke one Tuesday to discover my power had been mistakenly disconnected during utility maintenance that no one had informed me about or even scheduled. The electric company offered profuse apologies, clarifying that the HOA maintenance team had somehow persuaded them my power lines required an emergency shutdown for safety purposes. It's amusing how safety emergencies tend to arise shortly after one embarrasses someone in federal court. But Trish was merely getting started. By Thursday, my driveway was impassable due to emergency road repairs that dragged on for weeks, resembling some form of asphalt-based purgatory. The county asserted it was critical infrastructure work, although the roads of the rest of the neighborhood curiously remained unaffected. Delivery vehicles were unable to access my property, mail delivery was halted, and I was forced to trek half a mile through the woods just to bring groceries to my home. The odor of diesel and hot tar became my constant companion as construction machinery sat idle for hours, achieving little more than making my life difficult. The final touch came when the EPA arrived to look into anonymous claims that runoff from my solar panels was supposedly tainting the groundwater. The investigator, a jumpy man named Bradley Winters, persistently dodged my gaze and perspired through his government-issued polo. It took me just 3 minutes of relaxed conversation to deduce why he looked familiar. He was Trish's brother-in-law, married to her younger sister. There's nothing like keeping environmental regulation within the family. That's when a saying from my old mentor, Judge Harrison, came to mind. Sam, criminals invariably record their own misdeeds if you have the patience to locate the evidence. Consequently, I began to record everything with the systematic precision that had made me renowned in federal court. My security cameras captured the HOA maintenance crew interfering with my power lines at 2 in the morning, clad in matching coveralls that likely cost more than an average person's monthly income. A straightforward records check showed that the road construction had been commissioned by Trish herself, without the necessary county authorization or permits. Better still, the young Bradley had submitted his EPA complaint from his personal email, which was conveniently connected to the Blackwood family Christmas card album on social media. It was time to make this public. I got in touch with Miranda Torres, an investigative journalist at Channel 7 who had a knack for covering government corruption. Miranda was razor-sharp and eager for a story that could define her career, particularly one concerning HOA overreach and nepotism. I provided her with a comprehensive evidence file, security footage of utility tampering, counterfeit work orders, documents detailing financial mismanagement, and proof of the EPA conflict of interest that would bring tears of joy to any ethics attorney. Within 48 hours, Channel 7 began broadcasting a 3-part expose titled HOA Gone Rogue. Miranda's reportage uncovered that Trish had been systematically bullying residents throughout the community, issuing threats of fines and liens for violations such as garden gnomes and non-compliant mailbox colors. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, broke down on air, recounting how Trish had threatened to foreclose on her property due to a small vegetable patch that breached aesthetic unity rules. The story spread through local property forums more rapidly than a rumor at a potluck. Consequently, attendance at HOA meetings swelled from the typical 5 board members to over 60 incensed residents demanding accountability. But Trish was not one to retreat quietly. She convened an emergency HOA meeting to counter what she called the disinformation campaign being waged against our community leadership. Positioned at the front of the crowded community hall, she tried to amend the HOA bylaws retroactively to encompass my property, asserting it was essential to safeguard everyone's property values from a single selfish person. When several residents noted that retroactive rule changes were against the law, Trish presented a petition bearing 47 signatures that supposedly supported the amendments. The only issue was that I identified at least 12 of those signatures as forgeries, having dedicated years to scrutinizing fraudulent documents in federal court. When I questioned the petition's validity and insisted on signature verification, Trish's self-control finally disintegrated. This man is a dangerous anti-government extremist who has been concealing his criminal history from all of you, she shrieked, aiming a shaking finger at me that exposed her desperation. He is attempting to ruin our community because he detests law and order. The irony was so palpable you could slice it with a knife. Here stood a woman who had been flagrantly breaking laws, accusing a federal judge of being anti-government. The stale odor of hastily copied legal papers permeated the air as a nervous tension buzzed through the packed room like static before a storm. I simply smiled and remained silent, aware that every word she uttered was digging her own grave that much deeper. Following her public breakdown at the HOA meeting, Trish escalated to a campaign of personal ruin. In a matter of days, rumors began to circulate through the community like a contagion. Hushed talks in the grocery store suggested I was a disgraced judge on the run from a major scandal. Anonymous flyers materialized overnight on car windshields and at front doors, displaying my picture with bold captions like "Dangerous criminal living among U.S." and imploring residents to protect your families from this threat. Yet, Trish committed her most significant error when she targeted my family. My daughter, Sarah, began getting menacing phone calls at her Denver law firm from unidentified callers who claimed her father was a corrupt judge who had accepted bribes and manipulated verdicts. The calls were consistently brief and untraceable, just long enough to sow seeds of fear and uncertainty. When I discovered Judge Scum, go home scrawled across my front fence in aggressive red letters, the biting smell of fresh paint mingling with the crisp mountain air signified that we had moved from harassment to something far more sinister. The community split more quickly than oil and water. Newer residents, mainly Trish's supporters who had bought into her property value rhetoric, would avert their gaze when they encountered me in town. However, the longtime residents, families who had been here since before the new developments, started to approach me discreetly with words of support. Mrs. Peterson brought me homemade cookies, whispering that she had never for a moment believed the rumors. Tom Morrison, a local contractor, came by to repair my fence and shared that Trish had cost him a $30,000 contract by disseminating falsehoods about his workmanship. The HOA meetings transformed into battlegrounds, with shouting matches that likely carried to the next county, while the smell of apprehension at these events was more potent than the coffee. It was then I resolved to retaliate with every tool I had acquired over 20 years of federal service. I contacted my former associates at the FBI's Cybercrime Division, the very men and women who had assisted me in prosecuting digital stalkers and online harassers. Within a week, they had pinpointed the anonymous threatening calls to computers located at Trish's real estate agency, complete with IP addresses and timestamps. From my experience with federal cases, I understood that meticulously documenting everything with precise timestamps and digital proof builds ironclad harassment lawsuits that even the most skilled defense lawyers cannot dismantle. I also submitted a formal judicial misconduct complaint against Bradley Winters, the EPA brother-in-law, for his blatant conflict of interest and misuse of federal power. But my ace in the hole proved to be 73-year-old Margaret Taylor, a retired librarian who had been discreetly compiling evidence of HOA corruption for months. Maggie, one of the original HOA founders from a time when it was merely an informal group for coordinating snow removal and road upkeep, approached me after one particularly contentious meeting. Her arms were laden with bankers' boxes that smelled of old paper and resolve. "Judge Riverside," she addressed me, using my formal title for the first time, "I believe you ought to see these." Inside those boxes were duplicates of every HOA document since its inception, including the original charter, which explicitly shielded pre-existing properties from any subsequent rule changes. More critically, Maggie had been surreptitiously recording HOA meetings on her smartphone for the last year, capturing hours of Trish's threats, falsehoods, and unlawful machinations. To mend community relationships and disprove Trish's portrayal of me as an antisocial recluse, I began hosting weekend barbecues on my land. The initial event attracted about a dozen neighbors, but reports of good food and frank discussion spread. By the fourth weekend, over 40 people were gathered, exchanging stories, cross-referencing notes on HOA harassment, and rediscovering the true meaning of a neighborhood community. The sound of children's laughter blended with adult dialogue and the sizzle of burgers on the grill, forging something that Trish's pristine developments could never replicate: authentic human connection. The tipping point arrived at the subsequent town council meeting, where Trish insisted my property be declared a public nuisance that jeopardized everyone's safety and property values. She had readied a PowerPoint presentation showcasing pictures of my violations, items like compost bins, rain barrels, and solar panels, which she asserted were eyesores and health risks. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium with the deliberate stride I had employed in federal courtrooms for 2 decades. Council members, I believe it's time you were made fully aware of whom you are dealing with. I disclosed a part of my judicial history for the first time, stating that I was a retired federal judge who had dedicated my career to prosecuting corruption and defending citizens' rights. The murmur from the crowd was like a breeze through pine trees, startled, intrigued, and suddenly paying close attention. Trish's face turned ashen as she grasped that she had been menacing a federal judge for months. Yet she pressed on with desperate rage. He is still a danger to our property values. His presence here undermines everything we have strived to build. The taste of impending victory was more gratifying than my morning coffee as I watched her credibility disintegrate like a house of cards in a gale. 2 days following the town council meeting, Maggie Taylor called me with an excitement usually reserved for lottery victors or new grandparents. "Judge, you must come over immediately. I've been reviewing those old recordings, and I've discovered something that changes the entire situation." Her voice resonated with the pride of a librarian who had just unraveled a decades-old enigma. I drove to her unassuming ranch house, where she had transformed her dining room into what resembled a detective's command center. Audio equipment littered the table, encircled by transcripts, financial records, and timeline charts that would have impressed my former FBI associates. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the musty fragrance of old legal documents as Maggie queued up an audio file on her laptop. "Listen to this," she urged, pressing play. Trish's voice, sharp and clear, filled the room from a recording made 3 months prior during what she believed was a confidential phone call after an HOA meeting. "Richard, the strategy is unfolding flawlessly. As soon as we push that stubborn old man out, we'll rezone the whole district for a luxury subdivision. Your father's council vote is a sure thing, and I'll collect my $500,000 finder's fee, plus insider development privileges." The responding voice was clearly that of Richard Petton Jr., whose father was a member of the city council and whose firm, Pinnacle Properties, specialized in upscale developments. "What about the other homeowners? Some of them are becoming wary about the finances." Trish's laugh was as sharp as shattered glass. "Let them be wary. By the time they discover where their HOA dues have been disappearing, we'll be in Costa Rica counting our cash." The recording proceeded with details that made my prosecutorial instincts tingle with excitement. HOA dues had been methodically redirected to a front company named Valley Management Solutions, which was merely a name on paper and was wholly owned by Trish. Emergency levies for special projects had funded her BMW lease, a trip to Europe, and upgrades to her real estate office. Several homeowners had been billed twice for services that were never rendered, while falsified board meeting minutes concealed the financial malfeasance from anyone who might raise probing questions. However, Maggie's investigation had unearthed an even more significant legal bombshell. "Judge, I was up all night examining incorporation filings at the state level," she explained, her librarian's discipline clear in the meticulous arrangement of her files. Trish never correctly incorporated the HOA under Colorado statutes. All enforcement measures taken over the last 3 years are, in fact, invalid. Every penalty, every lien, every intimidation tactic she had employed was legally void. Residents were eligible for complete reimbursement of unlawfully collected fees, which amounted to nearly $400,000. As a federal judge who had focused on white-collar crime for 2 decades, I recognized the criminal ramifications at once. Mail fraud for using the postal system to collect illegal dues, wire fraud for the electronic fund transfers to her front company, and conspiracy charges for the development plot with Peton. This was precisely the type of corruption case that had built my career. The irony was almost too exquisite. Patricia Blackwood had been threatening and harassing the one federal judge whose expertise was putting people exactly like her behind bars. "There's more," Maggie added, leaning in with a conspiratorial air. "I looked into your background online after the town meeting. You aren't just some retired judge. You're the one they nicknamed the Hammer for corruption cases." Trish has been menacing a legend. The prospect of justice was already more satisfying than my morning coffee, but I knew that a hasty prosecution would deny me something even more gratifying. Rather than immediately contacting my old colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I opted for a more poetic form of justice. I would permit Trish to carry on with her illicit activities, documenting each offense as she unwittingly sealed her own doom. The trap was laid, and Patricia Blackwood was on the verge of learning that some prey bites back. The following morning, I transformed my garage into a command post that would have filled any FBI task force with envy. Evidence boards covered the walls, interconnected by red string that traced Trish's network of corruption like a spider's fatal web. The scent of new printer ink permeated the space as documents poured out, producing timeline charts, financial audits, and communication records that illustrated a pattern of systematic fraud extending over 18 months. My team came together over the subsequent week like a cast from a legal drama, each member contributing distinct skills that augmented my federal court background. Maggie Taylor took on the role of my chief archivist, her librarian's precision ideal for managing heaps of documents and secretly taped conversations. Miranda Torres contributed her media contacts and a thirst for a story poised to capture national attention. Detective Ray Kowalski, my late brother's old police partner, offered law enforcement perspectives and contacts across the state. Elena Rodriguez, a civil rights lawyer focused on housing discrimination, came aboard after learning of Trish's pattern of targeting elderly and minority residents. The most unexpected member was Tom "Tank" Morrison, the local contractor whom Trish had cost a $30,000 job through her deceptions and manipulations. Tank provided deep knowledge of the construction industry and a personal vendetta that made him highly driven to see justice done. His weathered hands could interpret blueprints like a novel, and he instantly identified discrepancies in Pinnacle Properties' development plans that had eluded everyone else. Elena's legal examination uncovered something that made my anger rise. Trish's harassment was not arbitrary. She had systematically preyed on elderly residents, single women, and the handful of minority families in our area, employing varied methods for each demographic. The pattern pointed to intentional discrimination, a violation of the Fair Housing Act, thus adding federal civil rights offenses to our expanding case file. Over coffee that tasted of victory, Elena detailed how we could construct a class action lawsuit to reclaim the stolen money and secure significant damages for emotional suffering and civil rights infringements. Tank collaborated with a professional forensic accountant who mapped the money laundering operation through numerous shell corporations and overseas accounts. From my years prosecuting financial crimes, I knew that electronic fund transfers create digital trails that skilled prosecutors can easily follow, and Trish had been careless with her dealings. The digital path ran from HOA dues, through Valley Management Solutions, into accounts in 3 separate states, and ultimately into Trish's personal investment portfolio. My former FBI contacts assisted in retrieving deleted emails from the HOA's server, uncovering months of correspondence between Trish, Peton Jr., and the corrupt city councilman Richard Peton Sr. These conversations laid out bribery, vote buying, and schemes to rezone protected land for optimal development returns. One especially incriminating email chain talked about neutralizing the resistance by any means necessary, the very phrasing that would later be used to justify the arson attempt. Miranda orchestrated her media strategy, arranging with Denver TV networks and national property rights groups for extensive coverage when we exposed the full scale of the corruption. She had already engaged documentary filmmakers keen on transforming our story into a full-length exposé on HOA abuse in America. The sound of her keyboard clicking away late at night blended with the drone of copy machines as we readied for what she termed the biggest property rights story of the decade. But the true brilliance lay in our community mobilization. Maggie had discreetly connected with exploited HOA members throughout the valley, setting up clandestine meetings in her home where residents recounted their ordeals and tallied their financial losses. Mrs. Peterson had been fined $8,000 for her vegetable patch. The Johnson family was threatened with foreclosure over unapproved roof shingles. Young families with children were being pushed out by unattainable aesthetic rules that were altered monthly. Each account added another plaintiff to our burgeoning class action suit and another witness to Trish's systemic power abuse. We organized petition drives to oust Trish from the HOA board, formed alliances with other neighborhoods engaged in similar struggles, and linked up with national organizations that could offer legal assistance and media exposure. The feeling of coordination was invigorating, like leading an orchestra where every instrument played in perfect harmony towards a single, unavoidable climax. Throughout this, I kept up my friendly demeanor with Trish, allowing her to believe she was still in control, while she unknowingly supplied more proof with each desperate move. Every unlawful act was recorded, every threat taped, every financial dealing traced back to its criminal origin. My years on the federal bench had taught me that patience in case building leads to unassailable prosecutions that even the most skilled defense attorneys cannot defeat. The annual HOA meeting was set for the next month, with mandatory attendance for all residents. I intended to be present for the first time, equipped with a comprehensive evidence file that would annihilate Trish's criminal enterprise before the entire community. Federal prosecutors were on standby for an immediate criminal referral, media outlets were poised for a major story, and our legal team was ready to file both criminal charges and civil suits the instant our public showdown ended. The trap was flawlessly prepared, and Patricia Blackwood was about to step right into it. With the annual HOA meeting only 3 weeks off, Trish's desperation escalated. She approached me discreetly one evening as I was retrieving my mail, her BMW idling in my driveway like a predator claiming its ground. The scent of her pricey perfume couldn't quite conceal the odor of fear-induced perspiration as she emerged, holding a manila envelope, thick enough to be used as a paperweight. "Sam, let's be rational adults about this," she began, her tone syrupy sweet, but her eyes as cold as a mountain blizzard. "I believe there's been some confusion between us." She presented the envelope with hands that shook slightly, betraying her confident act. Inside was $100,000 in cash, crisp new bills held together with bank bands. "Just step away from this whole affair. Sell your land to my development associate, and it's a win-win. You get rich, the community is enhanced, and we can all put this behind us." When I courteously turned down her generous invitation to engage in federal bribery, her facade crumbled entirely. "Fine, but you have no clue who you're up against. I will ruin your name so completely that no one will ever trust a word you say again." She snatched the envelope back with such force that the paper tore, sending bills fluttering across my driveway like tangible proof of her panic. My security system captured our entire exchange, including her direct threats, which would later serve as compelling evidence in federal court. Within hours, counterfeit social media profiles began circulating elaborate falsehoods about my judicial career, asserting I had been under investigation for bribery and manipulating cases for affluent defendants. Anonymous letters inundated the state judicial board with allegations of misconduct, while harassing calls were directed at my former court personnel and judicial colleagues who had collaborated with me for decades. The smear campaign was professionally executed but criminally inept. Every digital assault left behind electronic traces that my FBI contacts followed back to computers at Trish's real estate firm and Pinnacle Properties. Her private investigator's background check had at last uncovered my real identity, plunging her into a state of sheer panic upon realizing she had been menacing a federal judge specializing in white-collar corruption. But while Trish was frantically attempting to erase evidence and conceal her activities, I was discreetly initiating a federal inquiry that would make her deepest fears seem like pleasant fantasies. The IRS audit I set in motion for Pinnacle Properties uncovered systematic tax evasion and unreported earnings from development kickbacks. The State Real Estate Board was provided with my complete evidence file, which detailed Trish's ethical breaches, fraudulent activities, and unlawful use of client money. From my years prosecuting such cases, I was well aware that attempting to bribe or threaten a federal judge carries a mandatory minimum 15-year federal prison term, a fact Trish was on the verge of discovering firsthand. Even the local bar association received an anonymous alert regarding Cartwright's involvement in the harassment scheme, accompanied by audio recordings of him knowingly submitting frivolous lawsuits. Community pressure was intensifying like steam in a sealed vessel. Neighbors who had been intimidated for years finally found the courage to voice their dissent, openly ignoring HOA directives and putting up "Stop HOA Corruption" signs all over the neighborhood. My weekend barbecues had expanded to include over 40 neighbors, all sharing stories, comparing information, and forging the kind of unity that Trish's divide-and-conquer strategy could not dismantle. Several HOA board members stepped down rather than continue to be part of what they now understood was a criminal enterprise. That's when Trish decided to wage all-out public relations warfare. She enlisted Morrison and Associates, an aggressive PR firm known for managing crises for corrupt politicians and corporate scandals. Their approach was stunning in its audacity: to depict me as a corrupt judge leveraging judicial privilege to evade legal property obligations while harassing an innocent community figurehead. Anonymous tips flooded the FBI, claiming I was a dirty judge accepting bribes, while strategically leaked media reports suggested I was misusing my federal contacts to intimidate law-abiding citizens. The PR offensive backfired spectacularly. Federal agents investigating the corruption claims confirmed my impeccable record within hours, while electronic surveillance of Trish's office exposed the full breadth of her conspiracy with Peton Sr. and Jr. Wiretaps captured conversations about witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and strategies to escape the country should their plans unravel. The metallic taste of fear was palpable in every taped conversation as Trish's voice became increasingly frantic with each passing day. The surveillance tapes were comedic gold, Trish hysterically shredding papers while simultaneously attempting to coordinate her defense with progressively more expensive lawyers who kept unearthing new offenses with every billable hour. Her office sounded like a convention of paper shredders combined with the anxious energy of criminals who sense the net is closing in. But the most damning proof came from her own lips during a recorded call with Peton Jr. If that judge thinks he can ruin me, he's about to find out what true power is. I don't care if it means burning down half the valley. I will not be defeated by some washed-up old man in a flannel shirt. That recording would later become Exhibit A in the conspiracy to commit arson charges, proving yet again that criminals are unaware of when to remain silent. 2 weeks prior to the annual HOA meeting, Trish's desperation hit an all-time low when she reached out to Danny Voss, Tank Morrison's resentful former employee who had been dismissed for on-the-job drinking and disregarding safety protocols. Danny was a walking calamity with enough grievances against the world to ignite a small conflict, making him the ideal pawn for someone prepared to cross the ultimate line into violent crime. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and chilling in its potential consequences. Trish gave Danny $10,000 in cash to orchestrate an accidental electrical fire during the next windstorm, a time when emergency services would be slow to respond and investigators would likely attribute it to natural causes. Danny's girlfriend, Lisa, however, retained enough of a conscience to covertly inform Detective Kowalski of the arson plot. He promptly collaborated with state and federal agencies to arrange a sting operation that would catch everyone in the act. On the designated evening, I relocated to my daughter's residence in Denver as a safety measure, while police and fire services took up positions around my property like chess pieces on a board. Concealed cameras recorded every perspective of the 40-acre property, and federal agents monitored radio traffic to collect evidence that would definitively seal Trish's fate. The air, thick with anticipation and the scent of autumn, held us in suspense as we waited for Danny to act, knowing that arson for hire carries federal charges with a minimum 20-year sentence when it involves interstate commerce or crosses state lines. At 2 in the morning, amidst a prearranged power outage that Trish had orchestrated through her contacts at the utility company, Danny showed up in his pickup truck, equipped with professional-grade accelerants and the kind of self-assurance that comes from believing you are cleverer than the authorities. He proceeded systematically, soaking the foundation and interior walls with chemicals engineered to produce an explosive blaze that would incinerate the evidence along with everything I had constructed. The fire department permitted the controlled burn to continue just long enough to secure undeniable proof, observing as my dream home vanished into flames visible for miles. The entire community looked on in shock as 2 decades of memories and 2 years of hard work were reduced to ash and smoke. Mrs. Peterson wept uncontrollably, while Tank Morrison's hands tightened into fists that could have bent steel. The wail of sirens echoed through the valley like a funeral procession, while the sharp smell of burning timber and shattered dreams permeated the night air with an odor of injustice that would be seared into my memory forever. Danny was taken into custody before the fire was extinguished, still smelling of accelerants and in possession of receipts that led straight back to Trish's cash disbursements. He confessed more quickly than a pancake flips on a griddle, disclosing not only Trish's payment and explicit directives, but also her contingency plan to attribute the fire to my supposedly unsafe solar panel setup. Bank statements confirmed her $10,000 withdrawal the day before the incident, and phone records showed 47 calls between them in the preceding week as they coordinated what they believed to be the perfect crime. But Trish's gravest error occurred the next morning when she contacted Channel 7 News to imply that I had set fire to my own house for the insurance payout. "I regret to say this," she informed the reporter, her words dripping with feigned sympathy, "but Samuel Riverside has been behaving with increasing instability. I possess evidence of his financial struggles, and I wouldn't be shocked if this was arranged to incriminate innocent community members while committing insurance fraud." The interview was taped and instantly became evidence of defamation, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Community fury erupted like a secondary blaze across the valley. Neighbors who had previously stayed on the sidelines now grasped the extent of Trish's depravity, creating relief funds for my losses and calling for a federal inquiry into the entire corrupt operation. Local churches offered their facilities for donations and support, while national property rights groups arrived in our small town with lawyers, media coverage, and resources that elevated our local struggle into a national symbol of defiance against HOA oppression. The federal intervention was swift and decisive. The U.S. Attorney's Office declared a major investigation into HOA corruption and arson conspiracy, while FBI agents executed search warrants on Trish's office, home, and real estate firm, leaving no aspect unexamined. Computers were taken, files were confiscated, and safe deposit boxes were opened, revealing the full scope of financial crimes that extended across multiple states. Pinnacle Properties offices were cordoned off with yellow tape as investigators unraveled money laundering operations through offshore accounts and shell companies. City Councilman Peton Sr. was put on administrative leave pending the investigation, his political career destroyed more rapidly than my house had burned. The EPA's Bradley Winters was confronted with federal charges for abuse of power and conspiracy, while Attorney Cartwright was now under investigation by both the Bar Association and federal prosecutors for his involvement in the harassment campaign. The taste of smoke still lingered in my mouth, but beneath it was a sweeter sensation, the satisfaction of seeing a criminal enterprise crumble under the weight of its own hubris. Patricia Blackwood had provoked a sleeping giant, and the following day's reckoning would be nothing short of spectacular. The emergency town hall was scheduled for the upcoming Thursday night, and by 6 p.m., the Civic Center auditorium was more crowded than a sardine tin. Over 400 residents occupied every seat, as media teams positioned their cameras and federal agents took up strategic posts among the attendees. The atmosphere was charged with tension and expectation when Mayor Richardson declared the meeting open, his voice scarcely carrying over the anxious hum of citizens seeking answers about arson, corruption, and the systemic power abuse that had plagued their community. Trish made a fashionably late entrance, her attorney at her side, embodying the role of a persecuted victim with a performance worthy of an Oscar. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit meant to convey authority and dignity, but her eyes scanned the room like a trapped animal seeking an exit. As she settled into her front row seat, the murmurs and hostile glares from the crowd signaled a decisive shift in public sentiment against her. My own entrance was met with spontaneous applause, initiated by Mrs. Peterson and quickly spreading through the assembly like a brush fire. Neighbors who had stood by me through months of persecution rose to their feet and clapped, soon joined by others, culminating in a standing ovation that went on for nearly 2 minutes. The sound reverberated off the auditorium's walls like a clap of thunder, and I saw Trish's complexion pale with each passing second as she grasped the complete erosion of her support. When Mayor Richardson invited me to the podium, I approached with the deliberate stride I had maintained in federal courtrooms for 2 decades. The room grew silent, save for the clicks of camera shutters and the low hum of recording devices. I took hold of the microphone and gazed at the array of faces before me, some welcoming, some intrigued, all anticipating the truth that would finally liberate our community. Ladies and gentlemen, I started, my voice imbued with the authority of 20 years on the federal bench. I believe it is time you were fully informed of whom you are dealing with. The silence lingered for 5 heartbeats, crafting tension like a symphony conductor poised for a dramatic crescendo. My name is Federal Judge Samuel Riverside, and for 20 years, I have served the Western District of Colorado, specializing in corruption cases that send criminals precisely like Mrs. Blackwood to federal prison. A collective gasp swept through the audience, a unified intake of breath as the gravity of Trish's blunders became clear. Camera flashes illuminated the room like strobes, while journalists furiously took notes. Trish's face shifted from pale to ghostly white as she comprehended that she had been threatening and harassing a federal judge whose reputation for dismantling corrupt officials was renowned throughout the legal profession. I laid out the timeline of harassment, corruption, and criminal conspiracy with the systematic precision of a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. Audio recordings of bribery attempts and threats echoed through the auditorium, while financial records displayed on screens revealed the methodical theft of nearly $400,000 in HOA funds. Photographic proof of property damage and vandalism was shown alongside bank statements that documented money laundering through shell companies existing only in name. Mrs. Blackwood, I declared, turning to confront her directly as the cameras recorded every second. In my 2 decades on the federal bench, I have dispatched dozens of corrupt officials to federal prison for offenses ranging from bribery and conspiracy to mail fraud and racketeering. Your arson conspiracy alone commands a 20-year federal sentence. But what disturbs me most is how you inflicted terror upon this entire community, preying on the elderly, minorities, and anyone who dared to challenge your authority. I paused, then addressed the packed auditorium with the full authority of my judicial position behind each word. But here is what Mrs. Blackwood failed to grasp. In America, we do not submit to petty despots who believe a title grants them the right to ruin lives. This stops now. Trish's composure finally broke entirely. She shot to her feet, jabbing a trembling finger at me, her voice escalating to a near scream that resonated through the astonished hall. He's a corrupt judge misusing his power. You are all being deceived by a criminal hiding behind his federal status. Her lawyer frantically attempted to calm her, but she persisted in her rant like a woman unhinged. I was safeguarding this community from a dangerous individual who despises everything we have strived to create. The irony was sublime. A woman who had perpetrated numerous federal offenses, now shouting about law and order as security officers approached her. You are all sheep, easily deceived sheep who fail to see that I was the sole protector of your property values. As she was led from the building, her voice echoing down the corridor like the lament of a vanquished tyrant, U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison approached the podium to declare a 47-count federal indictment that would ensure Trish would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. The taste of justice was sweeter than mountain honey as applause thundered through the auditorium, and I understood that sometimes the system does, in fact, work when good people finally take a stand against bullies. 6 months on, the legal resolution surpassed even my most hopeful forecasts. Patricia Blackwood was given a 15-year sentence in federal prison without parole eligibility, along with a restitution order for $2.4 million to the community she had tyrannized for years. Danny Voss was sentenced to 8 years for his role in the arson conspiracy, but cooperated extensively with the authorities, his testimony securing convictions for the entire criminal enterprise. The corrupt city councilman, Peton Sr., received 12 years and a permanent prohibition from holding any public office, while his son's development firm disintegrated amidst fraud inquiries. Even Bradley Winters, the EPA brother-in-law, was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and forfeited his government pension for his abuse of power. The process of community recovery commenced right after the verdicts. With the assistance of over 60 volunteers, I reconstructed my house, incorporating an improved layout that featured a community meeting area and a lending library where neighbors could convene without the threat of HOA interference. The new building integrated lessons from the fire, including enhanced fire resistance, upgraded security measures, and solar panels that served as a dual symbol of our community's strength. Property values across the valley actually rose as favorable media coverage drew in buyers eager to reside in a neighborhood celebrated for its stand against corruption. The most significant result was the creation of the Pinehurst Valley Educational Foundation, funded by the $400,000 of recovered HOA money and supplemented by matching contributions from supporters across the country. This scholarship program offers college funding to local students, with a preference for those aspiring to careers in law, journalism, or public service. Our yearly scholarship banquet has turned into a cherished community event, uniting families who once lived in dread under Trish's tyrannical rule, but now commemorate the strength of ordinary citizens collaborating for justice. My connection with investigative journalist Miranda Torres developed into something neither of us anticipated when this ordeal started. She earned a Pulitzer Prize for her series on nationwide HOA corruption, while I found that retirement is much more fulfilling when shared with someone who values both quality coffee and the gratification of holding the powerful accountable. We were married last spring in a ceremony at my rebuilt community space, encircled by neighbors who had become like family through our common struggle and eventual victory. The environmental projects we initiated have turned our valley into a beacon of sustainable living. The solar cooperative has lowered everyone's utility bills, and our community garden supplies fresh produce to the local food bank throughout the year. Rainwater harvesting systems installed across the neighborhood prove that conservation and community growth can go hand in hand, yielding something far more lovely than Trish's sterile development fantasies could ever have produced. My book, When Good Neighbors Go Bad, a federal judge's story, became a national bestseller, sparking similar resistance efforts in 12 states. Invitations to speak at law schools and community forums allow me to impart the lessons I've learned about combating corruption while fostering genuine community bonds. Congress requested my testimony on HOA oversight legislation, and the Federal Trade Commission has established a task force to examine systemic HOA abuse nationwide. The consequences of our actions continue to extend well beyond our small mountain valley. Colorado enacted the most robust HOA oversight laws in the country, mandating financial transparency, democratic processes, and criminal background checks for board members. Other states have adopted similar legislation, and federal prosecutors are now actively pursuing HOA corruption cases that were once dismissed by previous generations as mere civil disputes. Most crucially, our neighborhood learned that the courage of one individual can ignite collective action when people see they are not isolated in their challenges. The elderly residents who once hid behind locked doors now host potluck dinners and form advocacy groups. Young families have established playground committees and youth sports programs. Even former allies of Trish's regime have discovered ways to make positive contributions to our community's future. Each morning, as I step onto my rebuilt deck with a fresh cup of coffee and see the sunrise cast shades of gold and promise across our valley, I am reminded that justice is more than just incarcerating criminals. It is about fostering communities where good people can flourish, free from the fear of petty tyrants who confuse authority with power. Just last week, I received a letter from a distressed homeowner in Texas whose HOA is attempting to seize her property over a $50 unpaid fine. It appears this retired judge is returning to work. Another chapter of justice is waiting to be served.